Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 41 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Anaheim Ducks, in which the Sharks have lost 4-0. You know, there's no shame, I guess. Every once in a while, John Gibson of the Anaheim Ducks is going to put up an insane goaltending performance and put up a 46-save shot. Wait, what is that? It wasn't John Gibson in net? It was third-string goaltender, AHL goaltender Anthony Stolarz. Well, that's a bit embarrassing for the San Jose Sharks, it must be said. But in the end, they get shut out by him all the same. And this one starts off quite poorly for the San Jose Sharks. The Ducks scored the first goal of this game, of course, since the Sharks scored no goals this game. And that came from Max Comtois just in the first couple minutes of this one. And surprise, surprise, it was a backdoor tipping play. It seems like we see this basically every game in the past few games scored against the San Jose Sharks because the Sharks just can't seem to get their defensive coverage in front of the net sorted out. This time around, it was Christian Yaros who gives the puck away on this shift and allows the Ducks to get into a position to make this happen. The Ducks would then get two more goals in the first period coming from Volkov and then Volkov again to have a 3-0 lead at the end of the 20-minute period. It was not an impossible task for the Sharks to climb up, and in the second period they looked significantly better, and they were peppering shots onto Stolarz, and Stolarz made a couple of very nice saves, but a lot of the time the Sharks' shots were not particularly dangerous, it must be said. I would say the Sharks probably deserved maybe a couple of goals in this one, but in the end a couple of goals would have still ended up with a loss for the San Jose Sharks, so they just needed to, in general, play better. It kind of reminded me of the game against the Los Angeles Kings, where they had a decent first, a decent third, but a second period that was just so awful that it completely sank the game as a whole. In the third period, early on, it would be Ricard Raquel who would make it 4-0, and that would more or less put the game away for the Anaheim Ducks, and they'd get those 2 points. First thing to talk about would be the playoffs. Now let's start with the good news. The St. Louis Blues were not in action here tonight, but the Arizona Coyotes and the Los Angeles Kings were. The Kings took on the Vegas Golden Knights and lost in regulation. The Coyotes took on the Colorado Avalanche and also lost in regulation. However, the bad news is, of course, that the Sharks here tonight lost to the Anaheim Ducks, and it's not just bad that they make up no ground, but it's also bad is that the Sharks right now are playing their final 2 games against what you would call easy opponents. Obviously in the NHL there's no easy opponents, blah 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 blah, but these final 2 games against the Anaheim Ducks are the final 2 games against the 2 team, or against any team that is actually below the Sharks in the division standings. After this, the Sharks will head out to play 6 straight games against a combination of the Minnesota Wild and the Vegas Golden Knights, which all 6 of those will be very, very tough. So this was the time for the Sharks to try and get some points. Meanwhile, the Coyotes and the Kings, who are currently playing against teams like Vegas and Colorado, will be playing against easier teams somewhere down the line that they will look to take advantage of, something that the Sharks were unable to do here. So it's not great that the Sharks end up losing here tonight, especially since also it should be mentioned that the Sharks, this was their game in hand on the St. Louis Blues. Now the Sharks and the Blues have the same amount of games played, and the Blues still lead them by 4 points instead of the 2 if the Sharks could have won tonight. Next, talking about Martin Jones, he's back in nets tonight, and not really a surprise in that regard, and not an awful game for Martin Jones, it must be said. Obviously, in the end, he absolutely gets out-dueled by Anthony Stolarz. Stolarz gets the shutout, Jones does not get the shutout. Pretty black and white right there. But you take a look at all 3 of these goals, at least the first 3 goals in the first period, won't talk about the Raquel one just yet, but the first 3 goals in this first period were just, how could you really blame Jones for any of this? As I said, Comtois was a backdoor tip from just terrible defensive coverage in front and a giveaway from Yaros. The second one by Volkov was kind of just a very unlucky bounce. Hurdle actually is covering him decently well, but it bounces off some sort of weird combination of their sticks and somehow floats past Martin Jones on this sort of the pass across the crease. And then this third one by Volkov, this pass comes to the front of the net, and it is Volkov surrounded by 4 San Jose Sharks. There's only one San Jose Shark who's not in front of the net. I believe it was Yaros. All 4 other Sharks are right there crowding around Volkov, and yet Volkov manages to get his stick on this puck and shoot it past Martin Jones. That's just, the fact that that can even happen is just unacceptable from a defensive standpoint. And again, it's a tough one for Martin Jones to stop there. The one on Rickard Rakell, this is one that he technically could have had. It's a nice shot by Rakell. It's one that potentially goes off the stick of Brent Burns. I don't exactly know what happened with Brent Burns' stick on this one because it kind of flew out of his hand, or was it Rakell's stick who flew out of his hand? I'm pretty sure. But one of their sticks flew. So it was technically one that Jones maybe could have had if it wasn't tipped necessarily, but still, in the end, I don't think this was that much on Martin Jones this game. The Sharks needed to score at least a goal to even begin to try and put some of this on their goaltender. But the following game on Wednesday, I suspect Jones will probably be in net. I know a lot of people are saying that Kojonash can actually get back in the net for that one and get his first start of the season here. I would be surprised if the Sharks were to do that against the Anaheim Ducks. I feel like those 2 points now, considering this loss here tonight, are even more important for the Sharks to get, and you might as well go with your starter for that type of game and then maybe throw him in for the Friday game against the Minnesota Wild. That's just my idea, but maybe we will see Kojonash anyway. Next, I'll talk about Christian Yaros. So I said that he had the giveaway that led to the Ducks' first goal, but it should also be mentioned that he was actually on the ice for all 3 of these goals scored by the Anaheim Ducks, and it would surprise me if we see Christian Yaros in the Sharks lineup at any other point this season, and also if we see him on the Sharks roster at any point past this season. It feels as though Yaros, the previous few games that he played since the injury to Marc-Edouard Vlasic, hadn't been great, but I guess they also hadn't been completely awful. He was doing a half-decent job as a 6th defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, but this is definitely just an awful game that's going to completely kick him out of the lineup here. Hopefully Vlasic isn't out too much longer because the Sharks are going down a depth chart that they don't necessarily have many great options towards. Yes, they traded Frederick Claesson, but he wasn't that great of an option anyway. So I suspect we probably see Milosh back into the mix here in the following game against the Anaheim Ducks, because just having to see Yaros play again would be just disastrous for this team after the performance he put up here tonight. And finally, let's talk about Logan Couture. Throughout most of this season, or at least the earlier parts of this season, I had been talking about how Couture and Kane were neck and neck as which of these 2 players was the best forward for the San Jose Sharks this season. And it's pretty clear recently that Evander Kane has massively surpassed Logan Couture. There was a time where both of these players were very close in terms of point total, and now Couture trails Kane by, I believe, about 9 points. You see, and the reason for that is that Couture over his last 18 games has only scored a single goal. And you may be thinking, well, is he racking up the assists? Well, not really. Over those 18 games, he only has 4 assists during that time either, meaning that's 5 points in 18 games, which would put him on pace for maybe 23, 24 points over a full NHL season, which is obviously not good at all. For especially a player, honestly, for any top 9 player, but, especially for a player like Logan Couture. And I know as the captain, he is definitely somewhat brash when it comes to talking in the media, and he's certainly not afraid to call out the team when they're not playing well. But I feel like at this point, Couture absolutely has to look inward and look at himself in the mirror and say to himself that he himself is not doing particularly well over these past bunch of games, over this past month, where he's just not contributing as much offensively. Now, having said that, he has looked pretty good in a lot of these games. It's just maybe somewhat snake bitten in a lot of them, but still, when you're the captain, when you are one of the best players for that team, you have to be able to force your way onto the score sheet at some point, and 5 points in the past 18 games is just pretty much unacceptable. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday as they will play their 8th and final game against the Anaheim Ducks this season. They've had a good amount of success against the Anaheim Ducks, but they've now lost their last 2 games versus this team, and they'll look to close out the series with a decent result on Wednesday. Class dismissed.